Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently onto the sun-warmed streets of ancient Pompeii, where ordinary people lived extraordinary lives beneath the shadow of a mountain they called home, never knowing the August morning in 79 would be their last. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through vanished worlds that time tried to erase but couldn't quite forget. We walk cobblestone streets where merchants once called out their prices, where children ran laughing past fountains, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with salt air from the nearby sea. We stand in doorways where families gathered for evening meals, where lovers whispered promises, where artists painted frescoes on walls that would survive longer than empires. We imagine the baker pulling loaves from his oven, the fuller washing wool in great stone basins, the priestess preparing offerings at the temple of Apollo, all of them living their lives with no knowledge that Vesuvius was waking from its long sleep. Each episode here isn't just about dates and ruins. It's not about memorizing emperors or volcanic classifications or the mechanics of pyroclastic flows catalogued in textbooks. It's about the lives lived, the morning routines interrupted, the plans never completed, the stories frozen in ash and preserved across 2,000 years. It's about the humanity beneath the tragedy, the ordinary beauty of a single day that became forever. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. Pompeii in the year 79 was not a city of emperors or philosophers. It was not Rome with its marble senate and triumphal arches. It was not Alexandria with its great library and lighthouse beckoning ships from distant shores. Pompeii was ordinary, and that ordinariness was its quiet glory. 20,000 people called this place home, living in a bustling port town on the Bay of Naples, close enough to smell the sea, close enough to hear gulls crying over the harbour where grain ships unloaded and fishing boats returned with the morning catch. The streets were narrow, paved with massive blocks of volcanic stone worn smooth by centuries of cartwheels and sandaled feet. Stepping stones raised above the road allowed pedestrians to cross without wading through the mix of rainwater, waste, and whatever the previous night had left behind. Fountains stood at nearly every intersection, fed by aqueducts that brought fresh mountain water into the heart of the city. Public buildings clustered around the Forum, the central square where politics and commerce mingled beneath colonnades that offered shade from the relentless Italian sun. But Pompeii was more than its public face. Behind the grand facades of wealthy homes lay entire worlds, private gardens with trickling fountains, dining rooms painted with scenes of gods and heroes, bedrooms decorated with images we might blush to see today. The walls spoke. Graffiti covered every available surface, election endorsements and obscene jokes, declarations of love and bitter insults, the scrawled thoughts of people who never imagined anyone would read their words 2,000 years later. The city smelled of bread baking in wood-fired ovens, of wine fermenting in great clay vessels, of fish sauce aging in ceramic jars, that pungent condiment called garum that Romans poured over everything. It smelled of olive oil and incense, of wool being cleaned in vats of stale urine, a process that made fullers wealthy despite the stench. It smelled of horses and donkeys, of cooking fires and human sweat, of flowers blooming in hidden courtyards. It smelled of life, messy and vibrant and utterly human. Above it all loomed Vesuvius, a mountain so familiar that people barely noticed it anymore. Its slopes were green with vineyards producing wine that wealthy Romans praised in their letters. Shepherds grazed their flocks on its flanks. Farms dotted the mountainside, taking advantage of the rich volcanic soil that made everything grow with astonishing vigour. No one remembered that it was a volcano. The word itself didn't exist yet in Latin. They had no category for what Vesuvius truly was, no framework to understand the danger sleeping beneath those peaceful green hills. The mountain had been quiet for 800 years, longer than Rome had been an empire, longer than anyone could remember. There were no songs about eruptions, no old stories warning children to fear the mountain. If ancient peoples had once known its power, that knowledge had faded into myth and then into nothing. Vesuvius was just part of the landscape, as permanent and harmless as the sea, as trustworthy as sunrise. In the years before 79 there had been signs, though no one understood them as such. In 62, a massive earthquake had shaken the region, toppling buildings, cracking walls, sending people running into the streets in terror. The city had spent the following 17 years rebuilding. New frescoes covered cracked walls. Temples were restored with fresh marble. The Forum received new statues. The earthquake was seen as a disaster, certainly, but also as an opportunity for renewal, for improvement, for making Pompeii even more beautiful than before. There had been smaller tremors too, the kind that rattled dishes and made oil lamps swing on their chains. People grew accustomed to them. The earth shook sometimes, that was all. It was no more alarming than a thunderstorm, no more worthy of panic than a strong wind. Life continued. Business went on. Children were born and grew and married and had children of their own. On the morning of August 23rd, 79, Pompeii woke to another ordinary day. Bakers fired their ovens before dawn, slaves hauling wood and stoking flames until the brick interiors glowed red with heat. Water carriers made their rounds, filling amphorae at the fountains and delivering them to households throughout the city. Shop owners opened their shutters and arranged their goods, pottery and fabric, oil lamps and cooking pots, all the small necessities of daily life. In the amphitheatre, workers prepared for upcoming games. In the Temple of Isis, priests performed their morning rituals to the Egyptian goddess, whose worship had found a home here. In houses throughout the city, families broke their fast with bread and olives and watered wine, discussing the day ahead, making plans that would never come to pass. Nobody knew they had one day left. Nobody sensed that the earth beneath their feet was about to betray them. Nobody understood that the mountain watching over them was about to become their tomb. It was just another morning in an ordinary city, and that made what came next all the more terrible, all the more human, all the more worth remembering now as you drift towards sleep, thinking of all our ordinary mornings, all our days we assume we'll have tomorrows. The sun rose over Vesuvius, painting its slopes gold, and Pompeii went about its business, busy and loud and alive, completely, perfectly, tragically alive. For 16 centuries, Pompeii vanished. The city that had been so alive, so noisy with commerce and conversation, fell silent beneath 20 feet of volcanic debris. Ash and pumice buried the streets, filled the buildings, covered everything in a grey shroud that hardened over time into rock. The Bay of Naples changed its coastline. The River Sarno shifted its course. Fields and vineyards grew over the buried city. Peasants farmed the land above, planting crops in soil enriched by ancient catastrophe, never knowing they walked on rooftops. Memory faded. A few Roman writers mentioned the disaster, Pliny the Younger's famous letters, Cassius Dio's brief account written over a century later. But as generations passed, even the location of Pompeii grew uncertain. Was it here, beneath this hillside, or there, closer to the modern town? The name itself became confused with other lost places, other forgotten ruins. Italy had so many ancient sites, so many cities that had risen and fallen. One more buried town seemed unremarkable in a landscape littered with the debris of empire. In the late 16th century, an architect named Domenico Fontana was digging a canal to divert the River Sarno. His workers struck something unexpected underground, walls and painted surfaces, ancient structures that made no sense in that location. Fontana noted the discovery but did nothing more. He was building a canal, not searching for antiquities. The work continued. The canal was completed. The strange underground walls were forgotten, or at least ignored, covered over again and left to darkness. It was not until 1748 that serious excavation began, and even then it happened almost by accident. A Spanish military engineer named Roque Joaquín de Alcubierre was already digging at nearby Herculaneum, another town buried by Vesuvius, though that city lay beneath 60 feet of hardened mud rather than ash. The work was slow, dangerous, requiring tunnels and shoring, mining rather than excavating. But Herculaneum was yielding treasures, statues and mosaics, bronze sculptures and marble columns, all the things that made wealthy collectors excited and kings generous with funding. De Alcubierre heard rumours of ruins at a place called Civita, near a chapel dedicated to the Virgin of the Rosary. Local farmers sometimes turned up fragments of marble when they ploughed their fields. Old walls occasionally appeared after heavy rains. It seemed worth investigating. In March of 1748, his workers began to dig, and within days they knew they had found something extraordinary. The ash here was different from Herculaneum's mud. It was softer, easier to remove, and it had preserved everything differently. Where Herculaneum's organic materials had carbonized, turned to coal by heat and pressure, Pompeii's remained as hollow spaces, perfect moulds of wooden doors and shutters, of roots and beams, of bodies that had long since decayed. The ash had fallen like snow, drifting through open windows, filling rooms layer by layer, covering everything gently before hardening into tuff. What they found was astonishing. A city frozen mid-gesture. Bread still sat in an oven, carbonized but recognizable. 81 round loaves stamped with the baker's name. Eggs rested in a bowl. Wine remained in sealed amphorae. Graffiti-covered walls with such freshness that excavators could read election slogans from the year 79. Endorsements for candidates in races that never concluded. Votes that were never counted. In the house of the tragic poet, they uncovered a mosaic at the entrance showing a chained dog with the words Cave Canem beneath it. Beware of the dog. A warning that still worked nearly 18 centuries later. In the house of the faun, they found bronze statues of extraordinary quality, dancing figures frozen in eternal motion. In home after home, they discovered frescoes of such vivid colour and skilled execution that it challenged every assumption about ancient art. These were not the white marble fragments Renaissance artists had studied. This was ancient Rome in full colour, bright reds and deep blues, golden yellows and rich greens. But it was the human dimension that truly staggered the excavators. In the Garden of the Fugitives, they found 13 bodies huddled together, families who had tried to flee and failed, caught by the pyroclastic surge that killed them instantly. The ash had preserved the shapes of their bodies, the positions of their limbs, even the expressions on some faces, terror and resignation captured for eternity. Early excavators did not know how to handle these discoveries. They were treasure hunters more than archaeologists, interested in portable objects that could fill museums and private collections. They dug quickly, carelessly, pulling out statues and mosaics, leaving behind context and information. They damaged as much as they discovered. They treated Pompeii like a mine rather than a library, extracting wealth instead of reading meaning. Over time, methods improved. Excavators began to understand that Pompeii was not just a collection of artifacts, but a complete ancient city, preserved at a single moment in time. It was a snapshot, a photograph taken in stone and ash. Everything was still in place. The rich lived here, the poor there. This was a brothel, that was a bakery. Here was a fast food shop, a thermopolium with built-in clay jars for holding stews and soups. There was a laundry, a wine shop, a garum factory still reeking of fish sauce after all these centuries. They were not just finding Pompeii, they were discovering how Romans actually lived, not the idealized version from literature and imperial monuments, but the messy, ordinary reality. And with each spadeful of ash removed, with each room revealed, the city spoke more clearly across the silence of centuries, whispering its stories to anyone willing to listen, to imagine, to remember. The scholars of 18th century Europe struggled to comprehend what was emerging from the ash. Their understanding of antiquity came from texts, from Virgil and Cicero, from histories written by emperors and senators, from philosophy composed in marble courtyards far removed from ordinary life. They knew about patricians and gladiators, about forums and aqueducts, about the grand sweep of empire. But they knew almost nothing about how common people actually lived, what they ate for breakfast, what jokes they scrawled on walls, what anxieties kept them awake at night. Pompeii challenged everything. Here was a garum shop with the owner's name still visible, Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, a fish sauce manufacturer whose product had been shipped across the Mediterranean, whose brand was so well known that amphorae bearing his name turned up in distant provinces. He was not a senator or a general, he made condiments. Yet he had become wealthy enough to own a grand house, to commission beautiful mosaics, to leave a mark on his world that outlasted empire itself. Here was graffiti that made proper academics blush and argue about whether such things should even be published. Obscene drawings covered tavern walls, love notes and bitter rivals traded insults in scraped letters. A student had written out his lesson, practicing his alphabet in careful strokes. Someone had noted the exact amount owed to a prostitute. Another had complained about the quality of bread from a particular bakery. These were not the noble Romans of classical literature. These were people, rude and funny and petty and human. The quantity of artwork astonished everyone. Frescoes covered walls in even modest homes, not crude decorations but skilled paintings of remarkable sophistication. Garden scenes created the illusion of open space in cramped rooms. Mythological panels showed gods in dramatic poses. Still lifes depicted fruit and fish with such realism that observers swore they could almost smell them. Portrait medallions captured individual faces, men and women who gazed out across centuries with expressions that seemed utterly contemporary, familiar, recognizable. Visitors began making pilgrimages to the site. Wealthy Europeans on the grand tour, artists seeking inspiration, scholars desperate to see the discoveries for themselves. They walked streets that Romans had walked, stood in rooms where families had gathered, touched walls that ancient hands had touched. The experience was overwhelming, almost supernatural. Time collapsed. The dead city felt more alive than many living towns. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe visited in March of 1787 and wrote in his journal that many disasters have befallen the world, but few have brought posterity so much delight. He walked through the house of the tragic poet and marvelled at how small the rooms were, how different from the vast spaces he'd imagined. He studied the frescoes and realised that ancient art had been as colourful and lively as anything from the Renaissance. He stood in the forum and tried to picture the crowds that had once filled that space, the senators arguing, the merchants hawking their goods, the priests leading processions, but wonder mixed with unease. There was something disturbing about Pompeii's preservation, something voyeuristic about peering into private rooms, reading personal messages, seeing the evidence of lives interrupted. It felt like trespassing, like opening a letter addressed to someone else. The bodies troubled visitors most of all. These were not ancient skeletons, abstract and impersonal. These were people caught in final moments, positions of flight or prayer or protection, mothers shielding children, the elderly collapsed where they fell, the wealthy clutching their jewellery as though gold could save them from fire. Some questioned whether excavation should even continue. Was it right to disturb the dead, to expose their final moments to curious eyes? Was Pompeii a treasure trove of knowledge or a mass grave that should be left in peace? The debates grew heated. Antiquarians argued for the value of what could be learned. Moralists warned about disturbing the sleep of the dead, about divine punishment for violating sacred ground. The Catholic Church had its own concerns. Much of what Pompeii revealed contradicted the sanitized version of antiquity that European culture had constructed. The sexuality was too explicit, the paganism too vivid, the everyday life too ordinary and thus too relatable. If ancient Romans were just people like anyone else, if they worried about money and complained about neighbours and made crude jokes, then perhaps the classical world was not the noble ideal that Renaissance thinkers had claimed. Perhaps it was just as messy and complicated as the present. Yet excavation continued because the pull of discovery proved irresistible. Each day brought new revelations. Here was a complete surgical kit, bronze instruments that modern doctors could identify and name. There was a child's toy, a wooden horse on wheels. Here were dice and game boards, betting tokens and drinking cups, all the small artifacts of leisure and play. There were campaign posters, ancient politics frozen on plaster walls, candidates promising the same things candidates always promise, better governance and lower taxes and a return to traditional values. Pompeii forced a reckoning with history. It proved that the past was not some foreign country inhabited by heroes and philosophers, but a real place where real people lived real lives, as complicated and contradictory as any life lived today. It showed that tragedy could strike without warning, that whole worlds could vanish in a day, that everything we take for granted, our homes and routines and tomorrows, exists on the thinnest foundation, as fragile as ash. And it made clear that humanity itself had not changed. The loves and fears, the hopes and petty grievances, the laughter and tears of Pompeii were the same loves and fears, hopes and grievances, laughter and tears that filled any city in any age. 2,000 years meant nothing. The human heart remained constant, beating the same rhythms, breaking in the same ways, cherishing the same small joys against the darkness. The central paradox of Pompeii reveals itself the moment you truly consider what the site represents. It is simultaneously the most alive and most dead place on Earth, a city where time stopped but never quite ended, where the past feels so close you could touch it, yet remains forever beyond reach. Every wall, every object, every carefully preserved space whispers the same impossible truth. These people were going about their ordinary day, and then they were not, and everything they left behind became a monument to the fragility of ordinary days. Walk down the street of abundance and read the graffiti, fresh as though painted yesterday. Successus the cloth weaver loves Iris, innkeeper's slave girl, who does not love him back. There it is, a moment of heartbreak scratched into plaster 2,000 years ago, visible still, readable still, painful still in its honesty. Successus hoped Iris might see his message, might soften toward him. Did she? We will never know. Time ran out before resolution came. Here is a political endorsement. The fruit sellers, together with Helvius Vestalis, unanimously urged the election of Marcus Holconius Priscus as duovir with judicial power. They were campaigning for a local magistrate, organising support, planning their vote. The election was scheduled for late March of 80. It never happened. Vesuvius interrupted. The fruit sellers and Helvius Vestalis and Marcus Holconius Priscus all faced something far more absolute than municipal politics. In the bakery of Modestus, 81 loaves of bread sit in the oven where they were placed on the morning of August 24, 79. The baker probably intended to remove them after the appropriate time, to sell them to customers who would come by throughout the day. Some were likely already promised, orders from households or taverns. The bread carbonized in the heat but kept its shape, round loaves with the baker's stamp divided into 8 wedges for easy sharing. You can still see the cuts where the dough was scored before baking. It looks like bread from any bakery in any age, except that no one ever ate it, and the hands that shaped it turned to ash the same day. The contradiction extends beyond objects to the city itself. Pompeii was being renovated when Vesuvius erupted. Construction was underway at numerous sites, repairs from the earthquake of 62 still in progress 17 years later. Workers had left scaffolding in place. Piles of building materials sat waiting to be used. Fresh plaster covered some walls while others remained damaged. Cracks running through frescoes, columns tilted at odd angles. The city was imperfect, incomplete, caught between disaster and renewal, between what it had been and what it hoped to become. This incompleteness makes Pompeii more real, more relatable than any perfectly preserved monument could be. It was not a museum piece. It was a working city with problems and plans, with projects half finished and dreams not yet realized. The people who lived there were not thinking about posterity or their place in history. They were thinking about dinner and repairs, about business deals and family quarrels, about the mundane details that fill any life in any era. The finest example of this living quality exists in the Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the city walls. Here, frescoes cover an entire room with scenes of a mysterious Dionysian ritual. Women undergoing what appears to be an initiation ceremony, painted with such skill and vibrancy that scholars still debate their exact meaning. The colours remain astonishingly bright, the figures almost lifelike in their movement and expression. But in one corner you can see where the artist made a mistake and corrected it, painting over an error the way any artist might. Even this masterpiece was a work in progress, made by human hands prone to error, to second thoughts, to the messy process of creation. Yet for all its vitality, Pompeii is profoundly dead. The silence is absolute. No footsteps echo on the paving stones, no voices call from doorways, no children run laughing through the streets. The fountains are dry, the gardens are gone. The dogs and cats and horses that once filled the city with animal presence have left nothing but bones, and not even many of those. The ash preserved buildings better than it preserved life. This creates a strange emotional experience for visitors. You can stand in someone's bedroom and see where they slept, the alcove for the bed, the decoration on the walls, the window that let in morning light. You can picture them waking up, stretching, beginning their day, but you cannot hear them, you cannot speak to them. They remain ghosts, present but unreachable, close but infinitely distant. The contradiction deepens when you consider how Pompeii has been used over the centuries. It became a tourist attraction, a place people visited for entertainment and education, for the thrill of seeing preserved antiquity. Visitors walked through homes where families died. They marvelled at artworks in rooms where people suffocated. They laughed and talked and ate picnic lunches in a city that was fundamentally a cemetery, a place of mass death given the appearance of life by accident of volcanic chemistry. Even now, Pompeii exists in this strange in-between state. It is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, a place of wonder and scientific study, of tourism and scholarship. But it is also a tomb, a memorial, a reminder that disaster can freeze an entire world mid-breath. It is both a window into the past and a mirror reflecting our own mortality, our own assumption that tomorrow will come, our own vulnerability to forces beyond our control. The Romans who lived there never intended to create a time capsule. They were simply living, as fully and messily and hopefully as anyone lives. The tragedy gave their ordinary lives extraordinary permanence. The ash that killed them also immortalized them, turned their everyday existence into something scholars study and tourists photograph, and storytellers remember. They became famous for dying, their last day more significant than all the days before it combined, and so Pompeii remains, neither fully alive nor fully dead, a city caught forever between morning and darkness, between the ordinary and the eternal, whispering its contradictions to anyone who will listen. The question haunts every account of Pompeii's destruction. How could an entire city fail to recognize the danger? Why did so many stay when flight was possible? Why did they not run the moment the mountain began to shake and smoke? The answer is more complex than simple ignorance, tangled up in ancient knowledge, Roman fatalism, and the very human tendency to underestimate disaster until it becomes inescapable. Start with the most basic fact. The Romans had no word for volcano. The Latin language contained no term for a mountain that could explode, no category for what Vesuvius represented. They knew about earthquakes, certainly. The word terremotus existed, earth movement, and they had experienced plenty of tremors in the years leading up to 79. But the concept of volcanic eruption, of a mountain tearing itself apart and spewing molten rock and poisonous gas, of ash falling from the sky like deadly snow, existed outside their frame of reference. This was not ignorance in the modern sense. The Romans were sophisticated, educated, capable of remarkable engineering and scientific observation. But their knowledge had gaps, and one of those gaps was volcanology. Vesuvius had been dormant for at least 800 years, perhaps longer. No living person, no grandparent or great-grandparent, no ancient story passed down through generations contained any memory of the mountain erupting. It was just a mountain, green and peaceful, more likely to inspire poetry about vineyards than fear about destruction. Some scholars argue the earthquake of 62 should have served as a warning. It was catastrophic, damaging or destroying most buildings in Pompeii and the surrounding region. People died, infrastructure collapsed. The city spent nearly 2 decades rebuilding. But earthquakes happen. They were common enough in the Mediterranean, frightening but comprehensible, natural disasters that could be survived and recovered from. No one connected the earthquake to the mountain. Why would they? Mountains did not cause earthquakes. The earth shook sometimes, that was all. A phenomenon of the underworld, perhaps, of God stirring beneath the surface, but not something linked to that particular green slope. In the days before the eruption, there were signs that something extraordinary was happening. Wells and springs dried up as the water table dropped, pulled down by the movement of magma beneath the surface. Small earthquakes rattled the region with increasing frequency. Animals behaved strangely, restless and anxious in ways that made no sense to their owners. But again, how do you interpret such signals without the framework to understand them? Dry wells meant drought. Earthquakes meant the earth was unsettled. Animal behavior was mysterious but not necessarily prophetic. When Vesuvius finally erupted at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on August 24th, the initial response was not panic but confusion. The mountain produced a massive explosion that sent a column of ash and pumice 15 miles into the sky, blocking out the sun and turning day into night. But this had never happened before. People did not know what they were witnessing. Some thought it was a thunderstorm, an unnaturally dark and violent storm certainly, but still within the range of known phenomena. Others wondered if it was some divine event, a manifestation of the gods' anger or pleasure. The ash began falling almost immediately, light at first, then heavier, pumice stones raining down in a deadly grey storm. In Pompeii, people took shelter in their homes, a reasonable response to falling debris. They moved to interior rooms away from windows. They covered their heads with pillows and cloth. They waited for it to stop the way you wait out any storm. Hours passed. The ash kept falling. Roofs began to collapse under the weight. Still, many stayed inside, believing that venturing into the storm was more dangerous than remaining under shelter. Some did flee. Archaeological evidence shows that many Pompeians grabbed their valuables and ran, heading south toward the harbour or north toward the countryside, anywhere away from the suffocating ash. But flight was not easy. The streets filled with pumice up to several feet deep. Moving through it was like wading through snow, exhausting and slow. Visibility was nearly zero. The air was thick with ash and sulphur, hard to breathe, burning lungs and eyes. People wrapped cloth around their faces and pushed forward, but for the elderly, the very young, the sick, or those who hesitated too long, escape became impossible. There is evidence that some Pompeians interpreted the eruption through a religious lens. Offerings increased at temples and household shrines during the disaster. People prayed, made vows to gods, promised sacrifices if they survived. This was not foolish superstition. In a world where natural disasters were understood as manifestations of divine will, appealing to the gods made as much sense as running, perhaps more sense. If this was punishment for some collective sin, what good was flight? If this was a test of faith, abandoning the city might be the wrong choice. Wealth played a role in the death toll. The rich had country estates they could flee to, horses and carts for transportation, slaves to carry their possessions. The poor had nowhere to go and no means to get there. Flight meant abandoning everything, becoming refugees with nothing but the clothes on their backs. For many, that was not a choice they could make easily. Better to wait, to hope the disaster would pass, to trust that their homes would protect them. Modern volcanologists estimate that people had about 18 hours between the initial eruption and the pyroclastic surge that killed most of those who remained. 18 hours is a long time in some ways, brief in others. Long enough to flee if you started immediately, too short if you waited to see what would happen, if you hesitated while making plans, if you tried to save your possessions before saving your life. The truth is that humans are remarkably bad at assessing unprecedented threats. We use past experience to judge danger, and when something has never happened before, we default to assuming it will resolve itself, that normalcy will return. The Pompeians were not stupid or blind. They were human, making decisions with incomplete information, hoping that disaster would spare them, believing that their world was more stable than it proved to be. They had no framework for understanding what was happening. They had no historical precedent to guide them. They made the best decisions they could with the knowledge available, and they were wrong, terribly wrong, and it cost them everything. Understanding exactly what happened during those 18 hours between eruption and final catastrophe required centuries of detective work. Modern volcanologists, archaeologists, and historians have combined physical evidence from the site with ancient written accounts to reconstruct the timeline of Pompeii's death with remarkable precision. What emerges is not a single disaster but a sequence of deadly events, each giving victims a chance to escape, each killing those who remained. The investigation began in earnest in the 19th century when Giuseppe Fiorelli became director of excavations at Pompeii in 1863. Fiorelli revolutionized archaeology at the site by introducing systematic methods. Instead of treasure hunting, he focused on understanding the city as a whole. He divided Pompeii into regions and insulae, blocks of buildings, giving each structure a number and carefully recording everything found inside. He insisted that objects be left in place when possible, that context mattered as much as the objects themselves. But Fiorelli's most famous contribution came from a simple observation. Workers digging through the ash layers occasionally found hollow spaces in the hardened volcanic material. When they broke through these voids, they discovered human bones at the bottom. Fiorelli realized what he was seeing. The ash had encased the victims' bodies, forming perfect molds. Over centuries, the soft tissue decomposed, leaving empty spaces that preserved the exact shape and position of the dying. Fiorelli developed a technique that transformed our understanding of Pompeii's final hours. He carefully poured liquid plaster into these voids through small holes, filling the empty spaces where bodies had been. Once the plaster hardened, he excavated around it, removing the ash to reveal perfect casts of the victims. The results were staggering. These were not abstract skeletons, but three-dimensional sculptures of death, preserving clothing folds, facial features, even the expressions of final moments. The plaster casts revealed positions that told stories. Here was a man curled on his side, hands over his face, trying to shield himself from the heat and ash. There was a woman on her back, one arm raised as if to ward off the falling sky. A mother crouched over two small children, her body forming a protective shell that failed to save them. A dog twisted at the end of a chain, unable to flee, dying in desperate struggle. Each cast was a frozen moment of human or animal terror, preserved in perfect detail. Later investigations layered additional techniques onto Fiorelli's foundation. Stratigraphic analysis allowed researchers to identify distinct layers of volcanic deposits, each representing a different phase of the eruption. The lowest layer consisted of white pumice, the first material ejected when Vesuvius exploded. Above that lay grey pumice from later in the eruption. Then came the pyroclastic surge deposits, the deadly flows of superheated gas and rock that killed anyone still alive in the city. By measuring the thickness of these layers and comparing them to modern volcanic eruptions, scientists reconstructed the timeline. The white pumice fell for approximately 11 hours, accumulating to a depth of nearly 9 feet in Pompeii. This was the phase when most people who would survive actually fled, when escape was still possible despite the difficulty and danger. Those who remained either could not leave or chose not to, sheltering inside while ash buried their city. Around midnight, the eruption changed character. The column of ash and gas that had been rising miles into the sky became unstable. It collapsed, sending the first pyroclastic surge racing down the mountain slopes toward Herculaneum. This superheated avalanche of gas and rock moved at tremendous speed, perhaps 100 miles per hour, incinerating everything in its path. Herculaneum, closer to the volcano, was hit first, buried in an instant, its people killed with temperatures over 400 degrees. Pompeii, farther away, was spared this first deadly wave, but the reprieve was temporary. Through the night and into the early morning of August 25th, more pyroclastic surges followed, each one extending farther from the mountain. The fourth surge reached Pompeii's walls around 7:30 in the morning on the 25th, approximately 18.5 hours after the eruption began. It was not the ash that killed most of those who remained. It was this wave of superheated gas, too hot to breathe, moving too fast to escape. Death was nearly instantaneous. The heat caused brain tissue to vaporize, creating pressure that shattered skulls. Bodies assumed the pugilistic pose, arms and legs contracting from muscle trauma caused by extreme heat. But death came so quickly that victims had no time to run, barely time to react. Modern technology continues to reveal new information. Ground-penetrating radar map structures still buried beneath volcanic deposits. CT scans of the plaster casts allow researchers to examine the bodies inside without destroying the casts themselves, revealing injuries, health conditions, even the remains of final meals in digestive systems. DNA analysis of victims provides information about family relationships, showing who died together, who tried to protect whom. Each layer of investigation adds depth to our understanding, transforms Pompeii from a disaster into a detailed narrative of specific people facing specific circumstances. The baker who left bread in his oven was named Modestus. The wealthy banker who died clutching his keys was Lucius Caecilius Jucundus. They stop being generic victims and become individuals, people with names and occupations and last moments that we can reconstruct with increasing precision. Yet for all our knowledge, mysteries remain. We still do not know exactly how many people died. Estimates range from 2,000 to 20,000, a huge variance reflecting the difficulty of determining how many fled successfully versus how many perished. We do not know why certain areas of the city remain less damaged than others, whether the surges followed specific paths based on topography, or whether some walls provided meaningful protection. But we know enough. We know that Pompeii died over 18 hours, slowly at first and then catastrophically. We know that people had chances to escape and that many took those chances successfully. We know that those who remained did so for reasons that made sense to them, even if those reasons proved fatal. And we know that their deaths, horrible as they were, gave us an unparalleled window into ancient life, a gift they never intended to give, but one that speaks across millennia with clarity and power. The most detailed account of Vesuvius's eruption comes not from archaeology but from literature. 2 letters written by a 17-year-old boy to the historian Tacitus approximately 25 years after the disaster. Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, known as Pliny the Younger, witnessed the destruction from across the Bay of Naples in the town of Misenum, where he lived with his mother and his uncle, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet stationed there. These letters are extraordinary documents. They provide the only surviving eyewitness account of the eruption from someone educated enough to describe it clearly and distant enough to survive the experience. They are also deeply personal, mixing scientific observation with family tragedy, documenting not just a natural disaster, but the death of Pliny's uncle, a man he loved and admired, who sailed toward the eruption out of curiosity and died in the attempt to understand it. The first letter describes the eruption itself. Pliny the Younger was studying when his mother drew his attention to an unusual cloud appearing above the mountains across the bay. He called his uncle, who was resting after lunch. The elder Pliny, a man of insatiable curiosity and author of the Encyclopedic Natural History, immediately wanted a closer look. He ordered a ship prepared and invited his nephew to join him. The young man declined, preferring to continue his studies, a choice that saved his life. Pliny the Younger describes the cloud as resembling a pine tree, rising on a very long trunk and then spreading out into branches. This description gave science the term Plinian eruption for volcanic explosions that produce such distinctive columnar formations. He notes that the cloud was sometimes white, sometimes dark and spotted, depending on whether it carried more ash or more pumice. His observation was remarkably precise, the work of someone trained to notice and record details. The elder Pliny's motivation shifted as he prepared to depart. A message arrived from Rectina, a friend whose villa stood at the base of the mountain begging for rescue. What began as scientific curiosity became a rescue mission. The elder Pliny ordered quadriremes, warships with 4 banks of oars, launched not just for himself but to evacuate as many people as possible from the coastal towns beneath Vesuvius. The younger Pliny describes his uncle's journey based on accounts from survivors who accompanied him. They sailed directly toward the danger, ash falling onto the ships in increasing quantity, then pumice and pieces of blackened stone cracked by fire. The shoreline had changed, thrust forward by earthquake debris, making landing at Rectina's villa impossible. The elder Pliny altered course for Stabiae, a town south of Pompeii, where his friend Pomponianus lived. At Stabiae, the elder Pliny found Pomponianus terrified, his belongings already loaded on ships, waiting for the wind to shift so he could flee. The wind blew stubbornly from the north, driving ships back toward shore, making escape impossible. The elder Pliny, according to his nephew's account, affected calmness to reduce his friend's fear. He bathed, dined, and slept, or at least pretended to sleep. His loud snoring was heard by those passing his bedroom door, a detail so specific and human that it validates the entire account. During the night, the courtyard between Pomponianus's villa and the sea filled with ash and pumice to such a depth that remaining inside risked being trapped. They debated whether to stay indoors or venture outside. Buildings shook with frequent strong tremors. Outside, pumice continued falling. They chose the lesser danger, tying pillows on their heads as protection and heading toward the beach. The younger Pliny describes the scene his uncle's companions reported. Flames and fire appeared on Mount Vesuvius, bright against the darkness. The elder Pliny claimed these were fires from abandoned villas, an explanation meant to calm panic. On the beach, they found the sea still wild, impassable, retreat cut off by falling debris and violent waters. The elder Pliny lay down on a cloth, repeatedly calling for cold water to drink. Then flames and a smell of sulphur that warned of more flames approached, and the others fled. The elder Pliny stood up with the help of 2 slaves, but immediately fell down. His companions assumed that thick fumes had choked his breathing. When daylight returned 2 days later, they found his body intact, uninjured, looking more like someone asleep than someone dead. The second letter describes Pliny the Younger's own experience at Misenum, 20 miles from the volcano. Even at that distance, the disaster was terrifying. Buildings shook continuously. The sea withdrew from shore and then returned in strange tides. The cloud from Vesuvius spread across the sky, bringing darkness at midday. People panicked, some calling for the gods, others claiming the gods were dead and the universe returning to eternal night. Pliny the Younger and his mother fled the town with crowds of others, carts colliding in the narrow roads, panic spreading like contagion. They sat in a field beyond the buildings. Darkness fell so completely that it was not like a moonless night, but like being in a closed room with the lights extinguished. Women wailed, children cried, men shouted for family members separated in the chaos. Some prayed for death, believing the end of the world had come. Eventually dawn struggled through the darkness, though the light was pale and weak. They returned to find everything covered in thick ash like snow, buildings damaged but standing. The younger Pliny emphasizes his fear, his mother's courage, his uncle's death, all woven together in an account that feels honest, unvarnished, human. These letters have shaped our understanding of the eruption more than any other source. They provide the date, August 24th, though some scholars now debate whether it might have been in autumn rather than summer. They describe the sequence of events, the column of ash, the darkness, the pyroclastic surges. They give us human scale, showing how people reacted, what choices they made, how panic and courage coexisted. Most importantly, they remind us that this disaster was witnessed, recorded, grieved. The elder Pliny died trying to observe and assist. The younger Pliny spent part of his life telling the story, making sure his uncle's death meant something, that the disaster was remembered, that future generations would know what happened on that terrible day when the mountain exploded and cities died and the world briefly seemed to end. Among all the questions Pompeii raises, one cuts deepest into the human heart. Who are the people who stayed until the very end, who remained in the city through 18 hours of falling ash, who were still there when the pyroclastic surge came? What kept them from fleeing? What circumstances or choices or misfortunes trapped them in a city that was actively burying itself? The answers reveal layers of complexity about Roman society, about human nature, about the invisible chains that bind people to places even as those places become tombs. The plaster casts and skeletal remains tell us something about who died, though the story is incomplete. We know that many victims were not the wealthy elite. The rich had options. They owned country estates in the hills beyond Naples, villas in Stabiae or Herculaneum or farther afield. They had horses, carriages, boats. They had networks of friends and family who would shelter them. When disaster struck, the wealthy could leave, and many did, taking their portable valuables and trusting their real estate to fate. But not everyone had such options. In the Garden of the Fugitives, archaeologists found 13 bodies huddled together, a group that included men, women, and children of varying ages. Analysis of their bones showed signs of hard physical labour, the kind that leaves permanent marks on the skeleton. These were not aristocrats. They were workers, possibly slaves or freedmen, people whose lives revolved around physical toil. They had fled toward the city walls trying to escape, but the ash was too deep, the air too thick, their progress too slow. The pyroclastic surge caught them in the open. Slaves present a particularly tragic category of victim. We know from the positioning of some bodies that certain individuals were chained or shackled when they died. In one house, a dog was found still attached to its leash, twisted in the final throes of death, unable to run because its chain kept it tethered to a wall. If dogs were left chained, what of human slaves? Roman law treated slaves as property, valuable perhaps, but not autonomous beings with the right to make decisions about their own survival. Some slaves surely fled with or without their master's permission. Some were probably freed in the chaos, either by owners who recognized the extraordinary nature of the disaster, or by their own initiative when authority structures collapsed. But others remained bound, literally or figuratively, to homes and owners, waiting for permission or orders that never came, or came too late. The ash preserved their deaths without judgment, making no distinction between free and enslaved, between those who chose to stay and those who had no choice. The elderly and infirm faced their own constraints, moving through several feet of pumice while ash rained from the sky, and buildings shook with earthquakes was difficult for healthy adults. For the old, the sick, the disabled, it would have been nearly impossible. Some families surely fled while leaving elderly relatives behind. a calculation that sounds cruel but may have been seen as necessary for the survival of younger members. Better that some live than all die. Other families stayed together, choosing collective fate over selective survival, dying in groups as the casts show, bodies arranged in circles or clusters suggesting people who huddled together for comfort in final moments. Children appear among the dead in heartbreaking configurations. The famous cast of a mother sheltering two children shows her body curved over theirs, arms extended in an eternal gesture of protection that could not save them. Other children died alone, small bodies found in corners or under furniture where they had crawled seeking safety. Some were likely orphaned during the disaster itself, separated from parents in the panic and chaos, left to face death frightened and alone. Religious conviction may have kept some people in place. The Temple of Isis yielded the body of a priest or priestess, someone who stayed at their post even as the world ended around them. Were they performing final rituals, praying for deliverance, believing that abandoning the temple would be a greater sin than risking death? We cannot know their thoughts, but their presence in that sacred space suggests that duty or faith or both outweighed the instinct to flee. Economic desperation surely played a role as well. Pompeii was home to people whose entire wealth consisted of their shop, their tools, their inventory. Bakers had ovens built into the structures of their buildings, massive brick constructions that could not be moved. Fullers had great stone basins for cleaning wool. Wine merchants had amphorae too heavy and numerous to transport quickly. For people whose livelihood was bound up in immovable property, fleeing meant becoming destitute. Some probably stayed to protect their investments, hoping the disaster would pass, unwilling to accept the loss of everything they had built. Others stayed because they were simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Travellers lodging at inns, merchants who had arrived that day from distant cities and knew nothing of local geography, visitors to the amphitheatre or the forum who became disoriented in the darkness and ash, people who made small decisions to wait one more hour to gather one more possession, to help one more neighbour, and found that time had run out while they hesitated. Some victims show evidence of having been in the process of fleeing when they died. Bodies found on streets or near city gates, clutching bags or jewellery, turned toward exits. They tried. They recognised the danger. They made the choice to run, but the disaster overtook them anyway. The surge moved faster than any human could, faster than horses, an avalanche of superheated gas that gave no warning and no chance. The last to die were not a single type of person but a cross-section of humanity. Rich and poor, free and enslaved, young and old, local and foreign, faithful and pragmatic. Some stayed by choice, some by circumstance, some by misfortune. What united them was not who they were but when they died, in those final moments when Vesuvius sent its killing wave across the city, ending 18 hours of uncertainty with a terrible, absolute finality. Their deaths created the archaeological treasure that is Pompeii, but we should not let the value of what they inadvertently preserved obscure the tragedy of individual lives cut short, of choices that seemed reasonable until they proved fatal, of people who deserved more time and got none. They were the last to die, and their names are mostly lost, but their presence remains, frozen in ash, asking us to remember not just what was learned from their deaths, but who they were before disaster made them famous. The eruption began at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on August 24th, 79. The exact moment is lost to time. No clock survived to mark it, but based on Pliny the Younger's account and the angle of shadows in certain preserved spaces, volcanologists and historians have settled on early afternoon as the most likely time. In that instant, the world changed. 800 years of dormancy ended. The pressure that had been building beneath Vesuvius for centuries found release, and the mountain quite literally tore itself apart. What happened underground in the seconds before eruption was invisible to the people of Pompeii but catastrophic in scale. Magma had been rising through the Earth's crust for weeks, possibly months, filling a chamber perhaps 5 miles beneath the mountain's peak. The rock above this chamber had held against the pressure for a long time, but rock has limits. When it failed completely. The sudden release of pressure caused the magma to explosively decompress, like opening a bottle of champagne that has been shaken, except the bottle was a mountain and the champagne was molten rock heated to over 1,000 degrees. The initial explosion blew apart the top of Vesuvius. Rock that had formed the mountain's peak, thousands of tons of solid stone, was pulverized into fragments ranging from building-sized boulders to particles finer than sand. The explosion was heard hundreds of miles away. Pliny the Younger, across the bay in Misenum, described the sound, though his account does not survive in enough detail to know exactly what he heard. Other sources suggest a roar like continuous thunder, a sound so loud and prolonged that it seemed the earth itself was screaming. The magma, freed from the pressure that had constrained it, began racing upward through the newly opened vent at speeds that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching. It carried with it everything in its path, fragmenting rock, heating trapped water to steam, mixing solid and liquid and gas into a churning column that shot skyward at hundreds of miles per hour. Within minutes, the eruption column had reached heights that modern measurements estimate at 15 miles, perhaps higher, punching through the atmosphere into regions where the air is too thin to breathe. At that altitude, the column began to spread exactly as Pliny the Younger described, like a pine tree with a trunk and branches. Winds at different elevations pushed the cloud in different directions, creating the distinctive mushroom or umbrella shape that would later give scientists the term Plinian eruption. The cloud was not uniform. Its composition changed as different materials reached different heights. Heavier pumice fell out first, closer to the volcano. Finer ash travelled farther, carried by high-altitude winds across the Mediterranean. In Pompeii, 6 miles from the crater, the first sign of disaster would have been the sound, that impossible roar rolling across the landscape like physical force. People would have stopped what they were doing, looked toward the mountain, tried to understand what they were hearing. Then they would have seen the column, rising with terrifying speed, blocking out the sky, turning the bright afternoon into something dim and strange. The psychological impact of that moment is hard to imagine. Every person in Pompeii had grown up with Vesuvius as a constant presence, a green mountain, peaceful and productive, source of good soil and reliable geography. Seeing it transform into a fountain of destruction would have been like watching the sun turn black or the sea catch fire. It violated every assumption about how the world worked. The mountain was supposed to be permanent, stable, safe. Instead, it was killing them. Within minutes, pumice began falling on Pompeii. White at first, pieces of rock the size of walnuts or fists, light enough that they didn't injure people when they struck, but heavy enough that their accumulation would become dangerous. The pumice fell like snow, steadily, relentlessly, covering streets and roofs and gardens in a blanket that grew thicker with each passing minute. People tried to sweep it away from doorways to keep it from piling against walls, but the task was hopeless. It fell faster than anyone could clear it. The sky darkened as the ash cloud spread overhead. Not the darkness of night, which has stars and moon and familiar quality, but an oppressive gloom filled with falling debris and illuminated by the strange glow of the eruption column. The sun disappeared. Time became difficult to judge. Was it still afternoon? Had evening come? The normal markers that people used to orient themselves in the day ceased to function. The ash that fell with the pumice was finer, more insidious. It got into everything. Eyes, noses, mouths, lungs. It covered food and contaminated water. It worked its way under roof tiles and through window shutters. It turned the air grey and thick, hard to breathe, tasting of sulphur and stone. People wrapped cloth around their faces trying to filter the air, but the ash was so fine that fabric could not stop it entirely. The earth continued shaking, not a single earthquake, but a continuous series of tremors, ranging from barely noticeable to violent enough to crack walls and topple already weakened structures. Every shake reminded people that the ground itself had become unreliable, that the foundations of reality were literally unstable. Some tremors were probably related to the eruption, magma moving underground, creating seismic waves. Others were caused by the weight of falling pumice-stressing buildings beyond their design limits. This was the turning point, not because it was the deadliest moment that would come later, but because it was the moment when normal life became impossible to maintain. Before the eruption, Pompeii was a city going about its business. After the eruption began, it became a city fighting for survival. The transition was instant and absolute. There was no gradual decline, no slow realization that things were getting worse. One moment, ordinary. The next moment, catastrophe. The people who would survive had to make their decision now, in these first minutes and hours. Stay or flee. Trust the walls or trust the road. Wait for the storm to pass or run before it got worse. Every choice carried risk. Every delay meant deeper ash, darker sky, more difficult escape. The mountain had exploded, and there was no going back to the morning, no returning to the world as it had been. The only direction was forward, through the ash and darkness, toward an uncertain future that for many would not come at all. The eruption did not kill quickly, it killed slowly, methodically, over 18 hours that must have felt like 18 years to those trapped in the falling ash. This was not a sudden disaster, but a prolonged catastrophe, a marathon of terror where survival required not just luck, but sustained endurance, correct decisions made repeatedly under impossible conditions, and the physical ability to keep moving when every instinct screamed to shelter and wait. For the first 11 hours, from approximately 1 in the afternoon until midnight, Pompeii endured the Plinian phase of the eruption. The column continued rising from Vesuvius, steady as a fountain, pumping millions of tons of pulverized rock into the sky. The pumice fell in layers, white first, then grey, as the eruption tapped different levels of the magma chamber. The accumulation was relentless. 3 feet, 6 feet, 9 feet. Roofs designed to shed rain could not handle the weight. They began collapsing, first on weaker structures, then on better-built homes, the weight simply too much for timber and tile to support. People sheltered where they could. Those with interior rooms moved away from windows and doors. Those whose roofs had already failed crowded into spaces that still offered protection. The streets became impassable, filled with pumice that shifted underfoot like deep snow or loose sand. Moving through it required tremendous effort, and visibility was nearly zero. The ash cloud overhead blocked all light. Darkness fell at what should have been late afternoon, a darkness so complete that people could not see their own hands in front of their faces. The temperature dropped. This surprises people who imagine volcanic eruptions as walls of fire and heat, but the ash cloud blocked the sun completely, and August nights in Italy, even normal ones, can be cool. Add the terror, the exhaustion, the inability to build fires that would not be smothered by ash, and many survivors reported feeling cold, shivering in the darkness while the mountain roared and the earth shook and the pumice kept falling. Water became a problem quickly. The aqueduct that supplied Pompeii failed, either damaged by earthquakes or clogged with ash. The fountains ran dry, cisterns and wells filled with pumice and ash, contaminating the water beyond usefulness. People grew thirsty, desperately thirsty, and had no way to safely drink. Some probably consumed ash-contaminated water and suffered for it, the grit abrading their throats and digestive systems. Food was everywhere and nowhere. Homes contained stores of grain, oil, preserved fish, wine, all the normal provisions of daily life. But preparing food required fire, and fire required air, and the atmosphere was so thick with ash that flames would not sustain themselves. Even if you could cook, eating meant getting ash in your mouth with every bite. Many probably went hungry through those hours, not from lack of food, but from inability to consume it safely. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical. The darkness was absolute and prolonged. The noise never stopped. The roar of the eruption mixing with the clatter of falling pumice, the crack of collapsing roofs, the screams of injured or terrified neighbours, the wailing of children. Every sense was assaulted constantly. There was no moment of peace, no respite where you could catch your breath and gather your thoughts. The disaster simply continued, hour after hour, until time lost meaning and existence became nothing but endurance. Around midnight, the character of the eruption changed. The column that had been rising steadily began to falter. The mechanism is complex, but essentially the eruption was running out of momentum. So much material had been ejected that the pressure underground could no longer sustain the column at its previous height. It began to collapse, not all at once, but in pulses, sections of the column falling back to earth under their own weight. When an eruption column collapses, it creates something far more deadly than falling ash. The mixture of hot gas, pulverized rock, and air that had been rising now falls, racing down the mountain slopes at tremendous speed. An avalanche not of snow, but of superheated material moving faster than any human can run, faster than horses can gallop. This is a pyroclastic surge, and it kills everything in its path instantly. The first surge struck Herculaneum around midnight or shortly after. Herculaneum sat closer to Vesuvius than Pompeii, directly in the path of the collapsing column. The surge moved at perhaps 100 miles per hour, a wall of gas and rock heated to temperatures above 400 degrees. People in Herculaneum had no warning, no time to react. The surge swept through the town in seconds. Death was instantaneous. Bodies instantly superheated, brains boiled, flesh seared. Then the surge buried everything under 60 feet of volcanic material that hardened into rock. Pompeii, farther away, was spared this first surge, but the reprieve was temporary. Through the night, and into the early morning of August 25th, more surges followed. The eruption column continued to pulse and collapse, each collapse sending another deadly wave radiating from the crater. Each surge extended a bit farther than the last, probing outward like fingers, testing the limits of destruction. For people still alive in Pompeii, these hours were the longest of their lives. They could not see the surges coming. They could not know that the disaster had entered a new and deadlier phase. They only knew that the mountain continued roaring, the ash kept falling, the tremors never stopped. Some probably thought the worst was over, that they had survived, that dawn would bring relief. Others perhaps sensed that something had changed, that the quality of the disaster had shifted towards something even more terrible. Around 6:30 in the morning on August 25th, approximately 17.5 hours after the eruption began, the fourth pyroclastic surge reached Pompeii's northern walls. It flowed over the fortifications like water over a dam, pouring into the city with unstoppable force. The temperature was over 300 degrees. The gas was unbreathable, filled with particles that would sear lungs instantly. The speed was too great to escape. People who had survived 18 hours of falling ash died in seconds. The surge killed some through heat shock, the sudden extreme temperature causing instant physiological collapse. It killed others through asphyxiation, the superheated gas-burning airways and lungs. It killed through trauma, the force of the surge throwing people against walls or burying them under debris. However they died, it was fast, which was perhaps the only mercy in a disaster that had shown precious little mercy to anyone. A sixth and final surge followed shortly after, covering the city completely, burying it under several more feet of volcanic material. By mid-morning on August 25th, Pompeii was gone. The city that had woken normally on August 23rd, that had gone about its business on August 24th, even as the mountain exploded, was now buried under 20 feet of pumice and ash, its people dead, its buildings crushed or filled, its streets erased from the landscape. The 18 hours of fire had ended, and silence, absolute and final, descended on what had been one of the busiest, loudest, most alive cities in the Roman world. Before Pompeii, archaeology was treasure hunting. Wealthy collectors sent agents to dig up ancient sites looking for statues and jewellery, for coins and pottery that could be cleaned and displayed in private galleries or sold to museums. Context meant nothing. A statue pulled from a temple was treated the same as one found in a trash heap. The goal was acquisition, not understanding. Beautiful objects were saved. Everything else was discarded or destroyed without record. Pompeii changed that, slowly at first, then comprehensively. The site was too complex, too complete, too information-rich to be treated as merely a source of decorative objects. You could not understand Pompeii by extracting its treasures. You had to understand it as a system, a living city frozen mid-function, where every object related to every other object, where position and context carried as much meaning as the items themselves. The shift began with Giuseppe Fiorelli in the 1860s, though earlier excavators had started moving in this direction. Fiorelli insisted on systematic excavation. He divided the city into regions and numbered every building. He required that workers record where objects were found, what room, what position, surrounded by what other items. He pioneered the technique of leaving frescoes and mosaics in place rather than removing them, understanding that a wall painting means something different in a bedroom versus a dining room versus a shop. This approach revealed patterns that treasure hunting never could. Archaeologists discovered that bakeries clustered in certain neighborhoods, that fullers needed access to water, that brothels were identifiable by specific architectural features and decorative programs. They learned that Pompeii had social geography, rich and poor districts, industrial and residential zones, public and private spaces. The city was not random. It was organized, structured, comprehensible, if you took the time to observe and record properly. The discovery that changed everything came from the everyday objects that earlier excavators had ignored. Amphoras, those ubiquitous clay storage vessels, turned out to carry painted labels identifying contents and sometimes origins. By mapping where amphoras from different regions were found, archaeologists could reconstruct trade networks spanning the Mediterranean. Pompeii imported wine from Greece, grain from Egypt, fish sauce from Spain. The city was connected, cosmopolitan, part of an economic system that foreshadowed modern globalization. Graffiti provided another revelation. Thousands of inscriptions covered Pompeii's walls, everything from election endorsements to love poems to crude jokes to simple statements like Marcus was here. Earlier excavators had mostly ignored these scratchings, considering them vandalism rather than data. But scholars who actually read them discovered an entire world of ordinary life, concerns and humour and passions that official monuments never mentioned. One famous inscription reads, "I wonder, O wall, that you have not fallen in ruins from supporting the stupidities of so many scribblers. It is a complaint about graffiti written as graffiti, a Roman expressing annoyance at the same phenomenon we see today on bathroom stalls and subway cars. The continuity across 2,000 years is startling, humbling, a reminder that human nature changes far more slowly than human technology. The plaster casts of victims transformed how people thought about ancient disasters. Before Fiorelli developed his technique, the dead of Pompeii were abstract, bone fragments in ash layers. After he created the casts, they became individuals. You could see their clothes, their hair, their final expressions. The mother protecting children became an icon, reproduced in photographs and paintings, a universal image of parental sacrifice that transcended time and culture. These casts also raised ethical questions that archaeology still grapples with. Is it right to display dead bodies, even ancient ones, for public viewing? Are the plaster casts educational tools or voyeuristic spectacles? Different cultures and different eras have answered differently. Modern practice tends toward treating the cast with dignity as memorial objects rather than curiosities, but the tension remains between scientific value and human respect. Pompeii taught archaeologists that ordinary objects matter as much as exceptional ones. A cooking pot tells you what people ate. A lamp shows how they lit their homes. A loom weight indicates textile production. A gaming piece reveals leisure activities. Together, these mundane items build a picture of daily life that no amount of studying elite art and architecture could provide. The poor rarely appear in official records, but their possessions speak for them if you know how to listen. The site also demonstrated the importance of preservation. Early excavators exposed buildings to air and rain, causing rapid deterioration of frescoes that had survived nearly 2,000 years underground. Colours faded in sunlight. Plaster crumbled from moisture. Whole sections of the city were damaged more by excavation than by the eruption. Modern archaeology learned from these mistakes, developing conservation techniques, creating protective shelters, sometimes choosing to leave portions of sites buried rather than expose them to destructive elements. Pompeii established the principle of publication. Fiorelli and his successors documented their findings in detailed reports, making the information available to scholars who could not visit the site. They created drawings, photographs, maps, inventories. They built an archive that allowed the dead city to teach the entire world, rather than just those fortunate enough to walk its streets. This commitment to sharing knowledge became standard practice in archaeology, the understanding that excavated sites belong to all humanity, not just to those who dug them up. The influence extended beyond archaeology to other disciplines. Volcanologists studied Pompeii to understand pyroclastic surges. Engineers examined building collapses to learn about structural failure. Medical researchers analysed bones for information about ancient disease. Linguists studied graffiti for evidence of spoken Latin versus literary Latin. Art historians found intact decorative programs showing how rooms were meant to be experienced as unified spaces. The site became a laboratory for understanding the ancient world from every possible angle. Perhaps most importantly, Pompeii made the past human. Earlier archaeology had focused on kings and temples, on the exceptional and the grand. Pompeii showed that ordinary people living ordinary lives were just as worthy of study. just as capable of teaching us about history. The baker and the prostitute, the slave and the merchant, all became subjects of legitimate historical inquiry. Their lives mattered. Their stories deserved to be told. And in being told, they reminded every generation since that ordinary life is the real substance of history. That empires rise and fall, but people everywhere and always are simply trying to get by, to find joy where they can, to protect those they love, to build something that might outlast them. Pompeii did not teach us this lesson because the Pompeians intended to. They taught us by dying, by being preserved, by becoming inadvertent ambassadors from the past to all our tomorrows. There is something unbearable about the plaster casts of Pompeii's victims, not just sad or tragic or educational, though they are all those things, but unbearable in the most literal sense. Looking at them requires bearing witness to specific deaths, to final moments captured in three-dimensional detail, to human beings at the instant when life became death. No skeleton produces this effect. Bones are abstract, clinical, reduced to their structural elements. The plaster casts retain humanity. You can see clothing folds. You can see hands raised to protect faces. You can see the curve of a spine as someone tried to curl into a protective ball. You can almost see them breathing, though they have not breathed for 2,000 years. The first cast Giuseppe Fiorelli created in 1863 was an experiment. He did not know if it would work, if plaster poured into the void left by a decomposed body would successfully capture the shape before the surrounding ash crumbled. When workers carefully excavated the hardened plaster and revealed a perfect human form, complete with details down to the weave of fabric, Fiorelli understood he had discovered something profound. This was not just a new archaeological technique, it was a window into death itself, a way of making the past tangible and immediate in a way that no artifact could match. The casts reveal how people died. Some are curled on their sides in what looks like sleep, suggesting death came so quickly they barely reacted. Others are twisted in agony, limbs bent at unnatural angles, faces contorted. The heat of the pyroclastic surge caused muscles to contract violently, pulling bodies into what forensic scientists call the pugilistic pose, like a boxer with fists raised. Arms bend up toward the chest, legs draw up toward the abdomen. The position is not one any living person would choose, but one that dead tissue assumes when exposed to extreme heat. The most famous cast shows a woman crouched over two small children. Her body forms a shelter, arms extended, back curved, trying to protect them with her flesh from the fire and ash. It did not work. All three died. But the gesture survived. Frozen for eternity, a mother's final act of love immortalized by the same disaster that killed her. The cast sits now in a glass case where tourists photograph it, where scholars study it, where it continues to perform its silent testimony to parental devotion and the inadequacy of devotion against catastrophic force. Another cast shows a pregnant woman. The curve of her belly is visible beneath her garments. She died with her child. Both lives ended before birth could separate them. Analysis of her bones suggests she was young, probably in her 20s, that she had borne children before, that she was healthy until the moment the surge killed her. She was someone's daughter, someone's wife. She had a name that is lost. She had plans that went unfulfilled. She had expected to deliver her baby, to raise it, to watch it grow. The eruption ended all of that, turned her into a teaching tool, a tourist attraction, a symbol of tragedy that serves everyone except her. The dog on a chain is another image that haunts viewers. The animal clearly struggled, twisted, tried to break free or find shelter. The chain held. No one came to release it. It died alone, panicked, unable to understand why its world had turned to fire. The cast captures the curve of its spine, the position of its legs, even the hollow where its collar sat. It is unbearably specific, this death of one dog in a disaster that killed thousands of people. Yet somehow that specificity makes it more, rather than less moving. We can imagine this dog. We can picture it living, waiting for an owner who would never return. Not all casts are complete. Some show only portions of bodies, a torso, a head, limbs separated from the rest. The pyroclastic surge that killed people also moved them, tossed them, buried them in positions they would never have chosen. Excavators find victims tangled together, family groups or strangers thrown into accidental intimacy, by the force of the surge. Untangling these bodies, understanding which limbs belong to which individual, requires patience and care and a willingness to look closely at death that not everyone possesses. Modern technology allows researchers to see inside the casts without destroying them. CT scans reveal the skeletons still present within the plaster, showing bone structure, dental work, old injuries, signs of disease. These scans confirm what the external shapes suggest, that the casts are not artistic interpretations but accurate replicas of real people at the moment of death. The bones inside match the shapes outside. Every detail is correct because the casts are essentially death masks for entire bodies, taken not from a living face, but from ash-encased corpses. DNA analysis of the bones provides even more information. Researchers can determine relationships, showing which victims were related to each other, which died together as families. They can trace ancestry, migration patterns, evidence of the cosmopolitan nature of the Roman world. One surprising finding is that many Pompeians were not Italian by ancestry, but showed genetic markers from across the Mediterranean and beyond: Greeks and Egyptians, North Africans, and people from the eastern provinces. Pompeii was a melting pot, diverse and interconnected, its population reflecting the reach of Roman power. The ethics of displaying the casts generates ongoing debate. Some argue they should be treated as human remains, afforded the dignity and respect we give to modern dead. Others point out that the casts are not actually bodies but plaster replicas, that the human material is the skeleton inside, and even that is so ancient that different considerations apply. Museums display Egyptian mummies. Archaeological sites show skeletons in situ. Why should Pompeii's casts be different? The counter-argument is that the casts are too human, too specific in their detail. They capture not just death, but dying, the process and moment of transition. They show fear and pain and final desperate gestures. This is different from displaying a mummy wrapped in linen or a skeleton reduced to anonymous bones. The plaster casts demand empathy in a way that more abstract remains do not, and that demand creates discomfort. A feeling that we are witnessing something too private, too raw, too much like looking at photographs of modern disaster victims. Yet the casts serve a purpose that justifies the discomfort. They make history personal. They prevent Pompeii from being abstract, from becoming just another archaeological site with dates and kings and architectural styles. The casts insist that real people died here, people with faces and families and last moments that deserve remembering. They create emotional connection across millennia, linking us to individuals we will never know, but whose humanity we cannot deny. Children who visit Pompeii and see the casts often ask difficult questions. Why did they die? Could we die the same way? Their parents struggle to answer, wanting to be truthful without terrifying, educational without traumatizing. The casts force these conversations, make us confront mortality and randomness, and the fact that disasters do not care about innocence or virtue. The good die alongside the bad. Children die with adults. Everyone dies equally when the mountain explodes. The plaster casts are among the most powerful artifacts ever created, not by artists but by circumstance, not intentionally but accidentally. They were not meant to exist. They were not designed to move or educate or disturb. They simply are testaments to specific deaths on specific days, preserved by ash and revealed by plaster, standing now as ambassadors from a lost world, reminding us in the most visceral way possible that the past was real, that it was populated by people, that those people suffered and loved and died just as we suffer and love and someday will die, and that their deaths, horrible as they were, can still teach us if we have courage enough to look. Not everyone in Pompeii accepted their fate passively. Among the victims and survivors, among those who fled and those who stayed, there were people who fought back, who resisted the disaster not with weapons, for what weapon works against a mountain, but with determination and will and the stubborn human insistence that life matters, that it is worth protecting even when protection seems hopeless. The clearest evidence of resistance comes from the Garden of the Fugitives, where 13 people died trying to escape. They did not sit in their homes waiting for death. They gathered what they could carry, organized themselves into a group and headed for the city walls. The ash was already deep, perhaps waist-high by the time they started. Every step would have been exhausting, like wading through deep snow that shifted and gave way beneath their weight. The air was thick with sulfur and particles. Breathing was difficult. Visibility was nearly zero in the darkness, yet they kept moving. The archaeological evidence shows their progress, footprints preserved in the ash layers, leading from the city centre toward the walls. They were trying to reach the countryside, perhaps believing that distance from the volcano meant safety. They made it farther than many others, got closer to escape than most who attempted it. But the pyroclastic surge caught them in the open, in what should have been the final stretch, death claiming them when salvation was perhaps visible ahead, though visibility means little when you are running blind through toxic darkness. Among this group was at least one adult carrying a small child. The skeleton of the child was found held in what would have been someone's arms, protected until the last possible moment. This person could have moved faster alone, could have had a better chance of escape unburdened. They chose to carry the child anyway. They chose relationship over survival, refused to abandon someone who could not keep pace. The surge killed them both. But that choice, that decision to resist the calculus of triage and maintain human connection, speaks to something profound about who we are and who we can choose to be even when everything is ending. Inside the city, other forms of resistance played out. Some people worked to save their property even as disaster raged. At one bakery, there is evidence that someone tried to protect the ovens, covering them with materials to shield them from ash. Why? Surely they knew bread-making equipment meant nothing compared to life. But perhaps the baker saw those ovens as more than objects. They were livelihood, identity, the work of years, and saving them was a way of insisting that the future still mattered, that there would be a tomorrow when bread would need baking again. At the Temple of Isis, priests continued performing their duties through the eruption. They gathered sacred objects, wrapped them carefully, placed them in secure storage, as though the temple would reopen after the disaster passed. They performed rituals, or at least made preparations for rituals, leaving evidence of their movements through the sacred spaces. At some point, the building began to collapse under the weight of ash. They could have fled. Instead, at least one priest chose to stay, dying at their post, found centuries later in a position suggesting they were still moving through the temple when the surge arrived. This is resistance of a different kind, the refusal to abandon duty or faith or the structures that give life meaning. In a rational calculus, staying in a collapsing temple makes no sense. But humans are not purely rational. We are creatures of meaning and purpose, and sometimes maintaining that meaning matters more than survival. The priest who died in the Temple of Isis was resisting the chaos, insisting through action that the gods still mattered, that sacred duty still held weight even as the world ended. There is also evidence of resistance in the form of looting and opportunism. During the disaster, some people broke into homes and shops to steal valuables. Archaeologists have found bodies of people who died clutching items that clearly did not belong to them, jewellery and coins gathered from multiple sources, sometimes found in bags or wrapped in cloth for easier carrying. These were not homeowners protecting their property. These were thieves taking advantage of chaos. This seems like a different kind of resistance, less noble, more selfish. Yet it too represents a refusal to accept the disaster's terms. The looters saw opportunity in catastrophe. They believed they would survive, that the stolen goods would have value in whatever world existed after the ash stopped falling. They were wrong, the disaster killed them too, but their attempt to profit from tragedy shows the same quality that drove others to save children or protect temples. They were asserting agency in a situation designed to strip all agency away. Some victims show signs of having fought the surge itself, impossible as that seems. Bodies found with arms raised, hands in front of faces, positions suggesting they tried to shield themselves from the heat and force of the pyroclastic wave. It would not have worked. The surge moved too fast, hit too hard, was too hot to be stopped by human flesh. But they tried anyway. In the last seconds of their lives, they did not accept death passively. They raised their hands, they turned away. They attempted defense against the indefensible. Children posed their own questions about resistance. Some of the youngest victims are found under furniture, in corners, in small spaces where they crawled seeking shelter. This behaviour is instinctive, not rational. Children hide when frightened. They seek small enclosed spaces that feel safe. The disaster did not respect these refuges, killed the children in their hiding places, but the impulse to hide is itself a form of resistance, the body's insistence on trying to survive even when the conscious mind might not understand the full scope of danger. The survivors, those who successfully fled Pompeii, represent the most successful resistance. They made correct decisions under impossible pressure. They started early. They moved fast. They did not stop for possessions. They helped each other or abandoned each other, whatever proved necessary for escape. Their resistance was not dramatic or noble necessarily. It was simply effective. They lived, which in a disaster is the ultimate form of resistance, the final victory over catastrophe. Yet even among survivors, the resistance was not complete. Many who escaped Pompeii were traumatized by what they experienced and witnessed. Pliny the Younger, writing decades later, still seemed to be processing the horror. Survivors carried guilt, wondering why they lived when others died, questioning choices they made, people they left behind. The disaster did not end for them when they reached safety. It continued in memory and nightmare, in the knowledge that they had seen their world end and somehow continued existing in the world that came after. Pompeii teaches that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it is running toward escape, sometimes it is staying at your post, sometimes it is carrying a child who slows you down, sometimes it is raising your hands against fire. The disaster did not care about these resistances. It killed the brave and cowardly alike, the faithful and the opportunistic, those who fought and those who accepted. But the resistance mattered anyway, not because it changed outcomes, but because it was chosen. Because in the face of absolute disaster, these people insisted on remaining human, on making choices, on acting with purpose, even when purpose seemed futile. And that insistence is worth remembering, worth honouring, worth carrying forward into our own uncertain futures. The rediscovery of Pompeii did not simply add information to the existing understanding of ancient Rome. It fundamentally transformed how Europe thought about the classical world, triggering a cultural awakening that rippled through art, architecture, literature, and philosophy. The buried city became a catalyst for reimagining antiquity, not as a distant age of marble abstractions, but as a lived reality populated by recognizable humans whose daily concerns mirrored those of any era. The 18th century had inherited a particular vision of ancient Rome, one constructed largely from elite literature and monumental architecture. This was the Rome of Virgil and Cicero, of the Colosseum and triumphal arches, a civilization of noble ideals and grand gestures. It was sanitized, idealized, safely distant. Pompeii destroyed that comfortable distance by revealing ordinary life in uncomfortable detail, showing that Romans worried about money and made crude jokes, that they loved and fought and feared just like everyone else. Artists were among the first to respond to this awakening. Painters flocked to Pompeii to study the frescoes, discovering techniques and colour palettes that challenged academic traditions. The bright reds and vivid blues of Pompeian walls contradicted the assumption that classical art was restrained and monochromatic. This was not the result of fading over time, as many had believed about Greek and Roman sculpture. This was intentional vibrancy, ancient artists choosing bold colours and dramatic contrasts. The neoclassical movement, already underway when Pompeii was discovered, absorbed these lessons and evolved. Artists like Jacques-Louis David and later Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres incorporated Pompeian motifs into their work, not just copying ancient forms but understanding them as part of a living aesthetic tradition. Architecture followed, with buildings across Europe and America adopting elements drawn directly from Pompeian houses. The atrium design, the use of frescoes, the integration of gardens with living spaces. Writers found in Pompeii a powerful metaphor and an inexhaustible source of stories. Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel The Last Days of Pompeii, published in 1834, became an international bestseller, dramatizing the eruption and its victims for readers who would never visit the site. The book was not particularly accurate historically, but it succeeded in making Pompeii emotionally immediate, in creating characters whose deaths readers grieved, in transforming archaeological data into human narrative. The Romantic movement embraced Pompeii with particular intensity. Here was disaster on a scale that dwarfed individual tragedy, nature asserting absolute power over human civilization, entire worlds erased in a day. Romantic poets and painters used Pompeii to explore themes of sublime terror, the beauty and horror of natural forces beyond human control. The buried city appeared in poems and paintings as a warning about hubris, a reminder of mortality, a meditation on the impermanence of all human achievement. But beyond metaphor and aesthetics, Pompeii triggered a more fundamental awakening about what history could be and how it should be studied. Scholars began to understand that the past was not just kings and battles, not just the grand sweep of empires rising and falling. History was also bakers and merchants, children and slaves, the ordinary people whose lives rarely appeared in official records but who constituted the actual substance of any civilization. This realization changed historiography, the writing of history itself. Historians started asking different questions, seeking sources that previous generations had ignored. What did common people eat? How were their homes organized? What games did they play? What did they write on walls when no one was watching? Pompeii proved these questions were answerable, that the material record preserved information about daily life if you knew how to read it. The site also challenged assumptions about progress and civilization. The 18th and 19th centuries believed deeply in the idea of progress, that humanity was advancing inevitably toward greater enlightenment and capability. Pompeii complicated this narrative by showing that ancient people had achieved remarkable sophistication in some areas that modern civilization was still working to match. Roman concrete preserved in Pompeian buildings proved more durable than many modern formulations. The engineering of the aqueduct system demonstrated hydraulic expertise. The artwork showed aesthetic sensibilities that were sophisticated, not primitive. This did not mean Romans were more advanced than moderns, but it suggested that advancement was not linear, that civilizations could achieve great things and then lose that knowledge, that progress was not inevitable or permanent. Pompeii had been a functioning, prosperous city with art and infrastructure and culture. Then it was gone. If it could happen to Pompeii, the implicit question ran, what prevented it from happening again? What guaranteed that modern civilization was more secure than ancient? The awakening Pompeii triggered was also deeply personal for many who engaged with it. Visitors to the site reported profound emotional experiences, a sense of connection across time that verged on the spiritual. Standing in a Pompeian home, seeing the kitchen where meals were prepared, the bedroom where people slept, the garden where they sought peace, created an intimacy with the past that no museum could replicate. The dead city felt alive in a way that living cities sometimes did not. This personal connection inspired many to reconsider their own lives, their own priorities, their own assumptions about what mattered. If disaster could strike Pompeii without warning, turning ordinary mourning into final catastrophe, what did that mean for how anyone should live? Should you hoard wealth and possessions, as so many Pompeian victims did, dying while clutching jewelry that could not save them? Or should you value relationships and experiences, the things that could not be destroyed by ash? Scholars began developing new fields of study based on what Pompeii revealed. Classical archaeology emerged as a distinct discipline, separate from art history or treasure hunting. Volcanology developed partly through studying the eruption, creating frameworks for understanding how volcanic disasters unfold and how to predict them. Urban planning examined Pompeian streets and neighborhoods to understand how ancient cities functioned. Every discipline that touched on human life found something to learn from the buried city. The awakening was not limited to elite scholars and artists. Popular interest in Pompeii was intense and sustained. Books about the site became bestsellers. Exhibitions of artifacts drew huge crowds. Travel to Pompeii became a standard part of the grand tour for wealthy Europeans and Americans. The site entered popular consciousness as a symbol, a reference point, a story everyone knew at least in outline. This popularization had downsides, a tendency towards sensationalism and oversimplification. But it also democratized knowledge about the ancient world, making classical civilization accessible to people who had never studied Latin or Greek, who would never read Livy or Tacitus, but who could understand the story of a city buried by a volcano and people who died trying to escape. The cultural renaissance Pompeii inspired continues today. New discoveries at the site still make international news. Artists still draw inspiration from Pompeian frescoes. Architects still study Pompeian homes. Writers still craft stories set in the doomed city. The awakening has never really ended because Pompeii keeps teaching, keeps offering new insights, keeps challenging assumptions about past and present alike. What began as an archaeological excavation became something far larger, a mirror held up to multiple eras, reflecting each century's concerns and questions back to itself. The 18th century saw in Pompeii a testament to classical civilization. The 19th saw a warning about nature's power. The 20th saw evidence of ordinary life and the importance of preserving it. The 21st sees climate disaster and fragility, and the question of what survives when everything seems to be ending. Pompeii awakened the world to possibilities, to different ways of knowing and understanding, to the value of the ordinary and the power of disaster, and that awakening continues, spreading outward in ripples that touch disciplines and cultures, far removed from a small Roman city that died 2,000 years ago but refuses to be forgotten. The core truth that Pompeii reveals is simple and devastating. Everything ends, not metaphorically, not eventually, not in some distant future we can safely ignore. Everything ends suddenly, completely, without warning or mercy, and the people it happens to are not fundamentally different from us. They did not deserve their fate. They were not more foolish or less careful, or somehow responsible for the disaster that claimed them. They were simply alive on the wrong day in the wrong place beneath the wrong mountain, and that was enough to erase them from the world. This truth disturbs because it challenges the stories we tell ourselves about safety and control. We like to believe that preparation prevents disaster, that intelligence and caution provide protection, that bad things happen for reasons we can identify and avoid. Pompeii says otherwise. The Pompeians were not ignorant. They were Roman citizens of a sophisticated empire, living in a well-engineered city with aqueducts and paved streets and public baths. They had architecture and art, literature and law. They knew how to build, how to trade, how to govern. None of it mattered when the mountain exploded. We want disaster to be fair, to follow rules, to make sense. We want the survivors to be those who made correct choices, who acted wisely, who deserved to live. Pompeii offers no such comfort. Some who fled early survived. Some who fled late died. Some who stayed in sturdy buildings were crushed. Some who sheltered in weak structures walked away unharmed. The pattern was random, determined by factors no one could have predicted or controlled: the exact path of pyroclastic surges, the specific timing of roof collapses, the direction someone chose to run when visibility was zero. This randomness is the deepest revelation, the truth that makes Pompeii more than just an ancient disaster. It is a mirror reflecting our own vulnerability, our own fragility, the thin line between ordinary day and absolute catastrophe that we all walk without acknowledging. We live beneath metaphorical Vesuviuses, threats we cannot fully predict or prevent, and we go about our days assuming tomorrow will come because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. Pompeii forces that contemplation. It shows what happens when tomorrow does not come, when the mountain you trusted explodes, when the world you built ends in ash. The revelation is not that disaster is possible. Everyone knows disaster is possible. The revelation is that disaster is ordinary, that it happens to ordinary people living ordinary lives, that there is no magical protection granted by virtue or intelligence or preparation, that we are all, every one of us, as vulnerable as the Pompeians were, and we do not know, cannot know, which ordinary morning will be our last. This knowledge should be paralyzing. If everything can end at any moment, why build or plan or invest in futures that might never arrive? Why plant gardens that volcanoes might bury? Why write books that fire might consume? Why love people who disaster might take? The Pompeians give us the answer through their example. They planted and built and loved anyway, not because they were certain of tomorrow, but because living means acting as though tomorrow matters, even when you cannot guarantee it will come. The bread in Modestus's oven is not just evidence of interrupted routine. It is testimony to faith in continuity, the baker's implicit belief that his work mattered, that customers would come, that life would continue. He was wrong about August 24th, 79, but he was right about every day before that. The bread he baked on August 23rd was consumed and enjoyed. The bread from the 22nd, the 21st, all the breads going back years and years, all justified his labour and his faith. One day of disaster does not negate a lifetime of ordinary success. The same is true for the graffiti writers, the people who scratched their thoughts onto walls, never imagining those thoughts would outlast empire. They were wrong about impermanence. Their casual scratching survived when official monuments crumbled. But they were right to express themselves, to leave marks, to say I was here, I lived, I loved, I existed. That truth matters independent of how long it survives. It mattered when it was written, and it matters now that we read it across the gulf of centuries. Pompeii reveals that meaning is not dependent on permanence. The lives lived there were meaningful to the people living them, even though those lives ended badly. The love between mother and child preserved in the plaster cast was real love, valid and true, even though it could not save them. The dedication of the priest in the temple was genuine dedication even though the gods did not intervene. Value exists in the moment, in the living, not in the outcome or the duration. This revelation challenges both nihilism and naive optimism. Against nihilism, it insists that life has meaning even when that life ends in disaster, that the Pompeians' existence mattered despite their deaths, that ordinary days count for something even when they are interrupted. Against naive optimism, it demands honesty about vulnerability, refusal to pretend that good things always happen to good people, or that we can protect ourselves from all possible harm through correct behaviour. What remains is a kind of clear-eyed engagement with life as it actually is, fragile and finite and precious because of that fragility. The Pompeians teach us not to waste our ordinary mornings, not because disaster might strike, though it might, but because ordinary mornings are where life actually happens. The grand moments, the crises and celebrations are rare. The everyday is constant. If we wait for significance, we miss the life we are actually living. The revelation extends to how we should treat each other. The mother sheltering children did not succeed in saving them, but her attempt to protect them matters. The person carrying a child through deep ash did not reach safety, but the choice to carry rather than abandon is meaningful. The relationships, the care, the small gestures of love and duty and connection, these are what make life human rather than merely biological. Disaster cannot erase the reality of those choices, the truth of those relationships. Pompeii also reveals that we are not separate from the people who died there. We are the same species, subject to the same vulnerabilities, capable of the same love and fear and hope. 2,000 years is nothing in biological time. The human heart has not evolved. The concerns that kept Pompeians awake at night are the concerns that keep us awake. The joys that made them smile are the joys that make us smile. They are not exotic others to be studied from safe distance. They are us. We are them, and what happened to them could happen to us. This identity creates responsibility. We are the inheritors of their accidental gift, the city they preserved by dying in it. We learn from their lives and deaths. We benefit from their disaster. The least we owe them is remembrance, acknowledgement, the recognition that they were people who mattered, whose ordinary lives had value, whose deaths were tragic not because they were unusual, but because they were ordinary people who deserved the ordinary continuation of their ordinary lives and did not get it. The deepest revelation of Pompeii is that ordinary life is sacred not because it is guaranteed, but because it is not. That every day we assume will have a tomorrow is a gift we do not deserve but receive anyway. That the fragility of everything we build and love and are does not diminish value but intensifies it. And that the proper response to living beneath the volcano is not despair but gratitude, not paralysis but engagement, not denial but acknowledgement that yes, this could end, and therefore this moment, this breath, this life, this ordinary morning that might be the last morning, matters absolutely and deserves to be lived fully while it remains available to be lived. Step back from the plaster casts and the excavated rooms, from the timeline of disaster and the catalogue of artifacts, and ask the question that matters most. What does Pompeii mean for us now, for people living in the 21st century, separated from that August morning by 2,000 years, and technologies the Romans could not have imagined? What does a buried city have to teach a world of satellites and smartphones, of climate data and early warning systems, of knowledge so vast that we carry the sum of human understanding in our pockets? The answer is uncomfortable. Pompeii teaches that knowledge does not equal safety, that understanding disaster does not prevent disaster, that all our technologies and preparations create the illusion of control without providing the reality. The Pompeians did not know what a volcano was. We know in exquisite detail, can model eruptions on computers, can measure seismic activity and gas emissions and ground deformation. We can predict volcanic behavior with reasonable accuracy, and yet when volcanoes erupt today, people still die. Cities are still evacuated or abandoned. Warnings are still ignored or misunderstood or come too late. Mount Vesuvius has not stopped being a threat. It sits above Naples, a modern city of over 3 million people, living in the shadow of a mountain that last erupted in 1944 and will certainly erupt again. Evacuation plans exist. Monitoring systems operate continuously. Emergency protocols have been developed and refined. Yet experts estimate that when the next major eruption comes, getting everyone to safety will be nearly impossible. The roads cannot handle the traffic. The warning time may be insufficient. People will hesitate, will wait to see what happens, will try to protect their homes and possessions, will repeat the same mistakes the Pompeians made for the same human reasons. This is the first reflection Pompeii offers. Human nature has not changed. We are still the same pattern-seeking, risk-assessing, future-planning creatures we have always been, and those traits that help us survive normal times work against us in extraordinary crises. We assess danger based on past experience, and unprecedented threats fall outside our assessment framework. We plan for futures that seem likely while ignoring possibilities that seem remote. We trust what has always worked, even when what has always worked is about to catastrophically fail. The second reflection concerns permanence. We build as though what we create will last forever. Cities, institutions, systems, relationships, we invest in them with the implicit assumption of continuation. This is necessary. Without assuming tomorrow, we cannot function today. But Pompeii reminds us that the assumption is an assumption, that everything we build exists on borrowed time, that the structures we trust can vanish with shocking suddenness. This does not mean we should stop building. It means we should hold our constructions lightly, remembering that they are temporary, that their value lies in their use while they last rather than in any illusion of permanence. The Pompeians built beautifully, created art and architecture of lasting significance. The disaster that destroyed their city also preserved it, giving their temporary creations an immortality they never sought or imagined. But the lesson is not that building is futile. The lesson is that we build for now, for the people living now, for the needs and joys of the present, trusting that if it survives, great, and if it does not, its value was in the having, not the keeping. The third reflection is about community and responsibility. Who survived Pompeii? Largely those with resources, with options, with the ability to flee quickly to places of safety. Who died? Disproportionately the poor, the enslaved, the elderly, the vulnerable, those whose circumstances gave them fewer choices. This pattern repeats in modern disasters. Hurricane Katrina, the Indian Ocean tsunami, Syrian refugees, climate displacement. Every catastrophe reveals the same truth, that vulnerability is not equally distributed, that some people have resources and options while others have neither. If Pompeii teaches anything, it should teach obligation. Those with means have responsibility to those without. Those with options have duty to expand options for others. The enslaved who died, still chained, should haunt any society that tolerates similar bondage in different forms. The children who died because their parents could not afford to flee should challenge any system that links survival to wealth. Disaster exposes what we prefer to hide. The inequalities we tolerate in normal times become death sentences in crisis. The fourth reflection concerns memory and testimony. The Pompeians did not choose to become teaching tools, to have their deaths studied and their lives excavated. They were simply people who died badly. That we learn from them creates a kind of reciprocal obligation. They teach us unwillingly. The least we owe them is to actually learn, to let their deaths mean something, to allow their tragedy to inform our choices and challenge our assumptions. But we must be careful what lessons we take. It is easy to use Pompeii as an example of human folly, to say they should have known, they should have fled, they should have recognized the danger. This is false comfort, the illusion that we would have done better, that we are smarter or more prudent. The truth is that we make the same choices in different contexts, ignoring warnings, trusting structures that will fail, assuming disasters happen to other people in other places at other times. Pompeii does not reveal the foolishness of ancient people. It reveals the ordinary limitations of all people, the ways we are all vulnerable to the same failures of imagination and assessment. The fifth reflection is about narrative and meaning. We need Pompeii to be a story, to have beginning and middle and end, to make sense as drama. So we craft narratives about hubris and punishment, about nature's power and human weakness, about last days and final moments. These narratives help us process the disaster, give it shape and meaning. but they also simplify and distort. The truth is messier, more random, less narratively satisfying. People died not because of some grand theme, but because the mountain exploded and they were too close. There is no deeper meaning to find, no moral to extract, just the blunt fact of disaster and death. Yet humans cannot live without meaning, and so we create it. We turn Pompeii into metaphor, into warning, into meditation. We use it to think about our own mortality, our own fragility, our own assumption that tomorrow will come. This meaning-making is valid and valuable, but we should remember that it is ours, not theirs. The Pompeians were not trying to teach us anything. They were trying to survive. That they failed, and that their failure became our lesson, is accident, not intention. The final reflection is the hardest. Pompeii asks us to acknowledge that we live on a planet of volcanoes and earthquakes, of storms and fires, of natural systems that operate without concern for human life or human plans. We have built civilizations in vulnerable places because all places are vulnerable to something. We have created the illusion of safety through knowledge and engineering, but the illusion is just that, an illusion. The Earth does not care about our cities. The mountain does not care about our plans. Nature is not cruel, but it is indifferent. And indifference can be more terrifying than cruelty, because it cannot be appeased or reasoned with or avoided through correct behavior. Living with this knowledge, truly accepting it rather than filing it away as abstract information, changes how we move through the world. It should make us gentler with each other, knowing that we are all fragile, all temporary, all walking the same edge between ordinary morning and catastrophic afternoon. It should make us more grateful for the ordinary days that pass without disaster, for the accumulated blessings of unremarkable continuation. And it should make us more intentional about how we use whatever time we have, not because disaster might strike tomorrow, though it might, but because life is happening now, in this moment, and moments do not wait for perfect circumstances or complete understanding before they pass into memory and then into nothing. Pompeii means this, if it means anything, that life is precious and fragile, that disaster does not discriminate, that knowledge is not safety, that we should care for each other because we're all vulnerable, that we should build and love and live even knowing it could end, especially knowing it could end, because the alternative is to die before we are dead, to live as though life does not matter, and that would be the real tragedy, the real waste. The real failure to honour the Pompeians who wanted simply to keep living, and could not and left us the gift of their preserved world, to remind us that ours will not last forever, and therefore deserves to be cherished while it lasts. Pompeii is not finished revealing its secrets. 2/3 of the city remains buried, waiting beneath volcanic deposits for excavators with the resources and will to uncover it. Every few years, new discoveries make headlines. A fast food shop with perfectly preserved frescoes, a stable with the skeletons of horses still in their stalls, a villa with rooms that rewrite understanding of Roman decorative programs. The dead city keeps speaking, keeps offering new information, keeps refusing to be completely known or finally understood. This ongoing excavation creates a paradox. Pompeii died in 79 but has been continuously alive in the cultural imagination since 1748. It exists in two states simultaneously, buried and revealed, ancient and contemporary, finished and ongoing. The disaster that created the site was instantaneous, but our engagement with that disaster has lasted centuries and shows no sign of ending. Each generation rediscovers Pompeii, finds in it reflections of their own concerns, uses it to think through their own questions about life and death and meaning. The modern experience of visiting Pompeii is strange and powerful. You walk streets that Romans walked, step on stones they stepped on, stand in rooms where they lived and died. The city is empty now, stripped of people and most of its portable goods, reduced to walls and foundations, yet it feels populated. Haunted not by ghosts but by the weight of knowledge, the awareness that this space once contained all the noise and mess of human life, crying babies and barking dogs, arguing spouses and laughing children, the full spectrum of ordinary existence now silent but somehow still present. The silence is broken by tour groups, thousands of visitors daily, cameras clicking, guides explaining, children asking questions their parents struggle to answer. This tourism is necessary for the site's preservation, the entrance fees funding conservation work, but it creates its own complications. How do you balance access with protection? How do you allow people to experience Pompeii while preventing their presence from damaging it? The feet of millions of visitors wear down the ancient paving stones. The breath of crowds inside buildings increases moisture that damages frescoes. Photography flashes, though now mostly prohibited, faded pigments over decades of exposure. Conservation at Pompeii is a constant battle against decay. The volcanic material that preserved the city also makes it vulnerable. When exposed to air and water, it deteriorates. Roofs that survive 2,000 years underground collapse within decades of excavation. Frescoes fade, mosaics crack. The temptation is to excavate everything immediately, to reveal all the buried treasures, but responsible archaeology now recognizes that sometimes the best preservation is leaving things buried, protecting them from the elements by leaving them in the protective embrace of ash. New technologies offer hope for studying the unexcavated portions without disturbing them. Ground-penetrating radar creates maps of what lies beneath. Remote sensing identifies structures and spaces. Digital reconstruction allows scholars to visualize buried buildings without the need to excavate. These techniques mean that future generations may know more about Pompeii than we do while disturbing less of it, learning through observation rather than extraction. The plaster casts pose their own conservation challenges. The originals, created in the 19th and early 20th centuries, are deteriorating. The plaster cracks. The skeletons inside shift and fragment. Modern conservators are creating new casts using advanced materials and techniques, preserving the forms for future study while retiring the fragile originals. But this raises questions about authenticity. Is a modern replica of a Fiorelli cast still the same artifact? Does it carry the same evidentiary weight, the same emotional impact? Pompeii has also become a symbol beyond itself, a shorthand for disaster and preservation, for the fragility of civilization and the endurance of memory. When people want to describe a place frozen in time, they call it a Pompeii. When they want to warn about unrecognized threats, they invoke Vesuvius. The site has entered global consciousness, recognized even by people who could not locate it on a map, who know nothing of Roman history but understand Pompeii as the city buried by a volcano, the place where time stopped. This symbolic status brings both benefits and distortions. It keeps funding flowing for excavation and conservation. It maintains public interest across generations. But it also simplifies and flattens the reality, turning complex archaeological site into simple morality tale, reducing thousands of individual deaths to a single narrative about hubris or fate or nature's power. The real Pompeii is more complicated, more human, more resistant to simple interpretation than the symbol allows. Yet the symbol serves a purpose. Humans think through stories, understand through metaphor, remember through symbols. Pompeii as symbol makes the disaster accessible, gives it emotional resonance, allows it to speak to people across cultures and time periods. The symbol may be simpler than the reality, but it opens the door to deeper engagement, inviting people to move from symbol to study, from simple story to complex truth. The legacy of Pompeii extends far beyond its physical remains. It changed archaeology from treasure hunting to scientific discipline. It transformed our understanding of daily life in the ancient world. It created conversations about disaster and vulnerability that continue 2,000 years later. It gave us a vocabulary for thinking about catastrophe and preservation, about the ordinary and the extraordinary, about how quickly everything can change and how much can survive even total destruction. The city that died in 79 lives in scholarship and tourism, in literature and film, in the imaginations of everyone who has encountered its story. It lives in the questions it raises about how to live knowing that disaster is possible, about what matters when everything is temporary, about how to find meaning in a universe that includes both tremendous beauty and random catastrophe. These are not ancient questions. They are human questions, as relevant now as they were when the mountain exploded and the ash began to fall. Walking through Pompeii as the sun sets, when the tour buses have departed and the crowds have thinned, you can almost imagine the city as it was. The light turns golden, warming the ancient stones. Shadows lengthen across the forum. The silence deepens. For a moment, the gap between then and now narrows, and you can picture the people who lived here, going about their ordinary days, making plans, solving problems, loving and working and existing in the simple faith that tomorrow would come. Tomorrow did not come, not for them, but it came for us. We inherited their city, their story, their inadvertent gift of a world preserved. The least we can do is remember them honestly, not as symbols or lessons, but as people, human beings who deserve the ordinary continuation of their lives and did not get it, who died badly but lived well for all the years before the disaster, whose ordinary days had value independent of how they ended. Pompeii does not sleep. It waits, partly buried, partly revealed, continuing to teach anyone willing to listen. It whispers across millennia about fragility and endurance, about ordinary life and extraordinary death, about the preciousness of the everyday and the inevitability of its ending. It stands as memorial and warning, as archive and monument, as the city that died and yet refuses to be forgotten, speaking still to all our tomorrows from the ash of its last yesterday, reminding us gently, persistently, kindly that this moment matters, this life matters. This ordinary morning that we take for granted is a gift beyond price, and we should live it fully, gratefully, humanly, while we can.